The desert wind carried whispers of ancient grudges across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory, where the year 1882 painted the horizon with blood and broken promises. In this unforgiving land, where Apache warriors still fought their final battles against encroaching civilization, a story unfolded that would challenge every notion of loyalty, love, and redemption. Jake Morrison had been riding the dusty trails for 3 days straight, his weathered face bearing the marks of countless desert storms and sleepless nights. The bounty hunter's reputation preceded him wherever he went, a man who could track anything that breathed and moved across the southwestern territories. But on this particular morning, as the sun climbed mercilessly toward its zenith, Jake would discover something that no amount of tracking experience had prepared him for. The sound reached him first, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Following a narrow canyon that cut through red sandstone cliffs, Jake guided his horse toward the source of the haunting melody. What he found in a small clearing would forever alter the course of his solitary existence. Before you continue with this incredible tale of forbidden love and redemption in the Wild West, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more amazing stories from the frontier. There, bound to a gnarled mesquite tree, sat a young Apache woman whose dark eyes blazed with defiance despite her predicament. Her wrists were raw from the coarse rope that held her, and her traditional buckskin dress was torn and dusty. But it wasn't her physical condition that struck Jake most profoundly. It was the fierce dignity that radiated from her even in captivity. The woman, who would later tell him her name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, had been cast out by her own people. The tribal council had discovered her secret meetings with a Mexican trader, a betrayal of Apache law that demanded severe punishment. Rather than face execution, she had been bound and left to die slowly under the merciless desert sun, a fate considered more merciful than the swift blade. Jake dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling softly in the oppressive silence. The woman's eyes followed his every movement, calculating, wary, but unafraid. She spoke no English, and Jake's Apache was limited to basic trading phrases, yet something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended language barriers. Without hesitation, Jake drew his knife and approached the tree. The woman tensed, perhaps expecting another form of torment, but Jake simply cut through the ropes that bound her wrists. As the fibers fell away, Ayana rubbed her raw skin and studied this unexpected savior with curious intensity. The cowboy offered her water from his canteen, which she accepted with cautious gratitude. In broken Spanish, she managed to convey her story, how her love for the Mexican trader had been discovered, how her own brother had tied the knots that bound her to this tree of shame. Jake listened, understanding more through her expressive gestures and the pain in her voice than through her limited words. As Ayana stood on unsteady legs, Jake realized he faced a dilemma that would test every principle he'd lived by. Returning her to her tribe meant certain death. Taking her to the nearest town would likely result in the same fate, as Apache women were rarely welcomed in white settlements. Yet leaving her alone in the desert was equally impossible. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Jake helped Ayana onto his horse and began the journey toward his remote cabin in the Dragoon Mountains, a place where he'd always found solace in solitude. Little did he know that this act of compassion would transform his hermit's existence into something far more complex and beautiful than he'd ever imagined possible. The ride to Jake's mountain refuge took 2 days, during which an unlikely bond began to form between the gruff bounty hunter and the exiled Apache woman. Communication remained challenging, but they developed a system of gestures and simple words that bridged their cultural divide. Jake learned that Ayana possessed knowledge of desert survival that surpassed even his own considerable skills. She could read the landscape like a book, finding water sources and edible plants that he would have overlooked. More importantly, Jake began to see past the cultural barriers that had defined his understanding of Apache people. Ayana's intelligence, humor, and resilience shattered his preconceptions. When she laughed at his clumsy attempts to pronounce Apache words, her entire face transformed, revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath layers of pain and mistrust. The cabin Jake called home sat nestled in a grove of oak trees, protected by towering granite peaks that seemed to touch the sky. It was a simple structure he'd built with his own hands, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and stone, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and windows that offered spectacular views of the valley below. For 5 years, it had been his sanctuary from a world that often seemed too harsh and complicated to bear. Ayana's presence changed everything. She moved through the small space with graceful efficiency, immediately understanding the rhythms of mountain life. Without being asked, she began tending to tasks that Jake had always handled alone. Gathering firewood, preparing meals with wild plants she foraged from the surrounding forest, and mending his worn clothing with skills that seemed almost magical. But it was the evenings that truly transformed Jake's existence. As they sat by the fire, Ayana would tell stories in her native tongue, her voice rising and falling with the cadence of ancient oral traditions. Though Jake couldn't understand the words, he found himself captivated by the music of her language and the expressive gestures that brought her tales to life. In return, he shared stories of his own, tales of his childhood in Texas, his years as a cavalry scout, and the events that had led him to choose the solitary life of a bounty hunter. Gradually, their limited shared vocabulary expanded. Ayana proved to be a quick learner, picking up English words with remarkable speed, while Jake struggled to master the complex tonal patterns of Apache speech. Their conversations became deeper, more nuanced, as understanding grew between them. It was during one of these evening talks that Jake learned the full extent of Ayana's sacrifice. The Mexican trader she had loved was not just any man. He was the son of a wealthy rancher who had promised to marry her and take her away from the constant warfare that plagued her people. But when her brother discovered their secret meetings, the trader had fled rather than face Apache justice, leaving Ayana to bear the consequences alone. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound. Not only had she lost the man she loved, but her actions had brought shame upon her family and resulted in her exile from the only community she had ever known. Yet as she spoke of these events, Jake detected no self-pity in her voice, only a quiet acceptance of the choices she had made and their consequences. As weeks passed, Jake found himself looking forward to each day with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Ayana's presence brought life to his mountain retreat in ways he couldn't have imagined. She created a garden behind the cabin, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the rocky soil with techniques passed down through generations of Apache women. She wove baskets from pine needles and willow branches, creating beautiful and functional objects that transformed the stark interior of his home. But more than these practical contributions, Ayana brought something Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing: companionship that went beyond mere convenience or necessity. Their relationship deepened from mutual respect to genuine affection, though both were careful not to acknowledge the growing attraction that sparked between them like electricity in the dry mountain air. The first real test of their bond came when a group of Apache warriors appeared at the cabin one morning, led by a man Jake immediately recognized as Ayana's brother, Nalnish. The warrior's face was a mask of controlled fury as he demanded his sister's return, speaking in rapid Apache that Jake couldn't follow, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Ayana stepped forward, placing herself between Jake and her brother, and spoke in her native tongue with a firmness that surprised the cowboy. The conversation that followed was heated, with gestures and raised voices that needed no translation. Nalnish had come to bring his sister home, but not for reconciliation. The tribal council had decided that her exile was insufficient punishment, and she was to face the death sentence that had been postponed. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Ayanna caught his wrist, shaking her head slightly. She continued speaking to her brother, her voice growing calmer but more resolute with each word. Finally, Nalnish spat in the dirt at her feet and turned away, but not before fixing Jake with a stare that promised future violence. After the warriors disappeared into the forest, Ayanna explained what had transpired. She had renounced her tribal membership permanently, choosing exile over execution. Her brother had given her one final warning: if she ever returned to Apache lands, or if any harm came to their people that could be traced to her presence among whites, he would hunt her down personally. The weight of this decision settled over both Jake and Ayanna like a heavy blanket. She had chosen life, but at the cost of everything that had defined her identity. Jake realized that his simple act of cutting her bonds had led to consequences far more complex than he had ever imagined. That night, as they sat by the fire in contemplative silence, Jake made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He reached across the space between them and took Ayanna's hand in his own, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work and the scars left by the ropes that had once bound her. "Stay," he said simply, the word carrying the weight of everything he couldn't yet express. "Stay with me." Ayanna's dark eyes searched his face, reading the sincerity and growing love she found there. Her answer came not in words, but in the gentle pressure of her fingers intertwining with his, a gesture that spoke of trust, hope, and the beginning of something neither had dared to dream possible. The seasons changed around Jake's mountain cabin, and with them, the relationship between the cowboy and the Apache woman deepened into something that transcended the boundaries of culture and race. What had begun as an act of mercy had evolved into a love story that defied every convention of their time and place. Ayanna's transformation was remarkable to witness. The broken, exiled woman Jake had found bound to a desert tree had blossomed into someone radiant with purpose and joy. She learned to read and write English with Jake's patient instruction, devouring every book in his small collection and begging for more. Her natural intelligence, freed from the constraints of her former life, flourished in ways that amazed them both. Jake, too, was changing. The solitary bounty hunter who had once found peace only in isolation now discovered that sharing his life with another person brought a richness he had never imagined. Ayanna's perspective on the world challenged his assumptions and broadened his understanding of the complex relationships between the various peoples who called the Southwest home. Their love affair was conducted in secret, hidden away in their mountain sanctuary where the judgments and prejudices of the outside world couldn't reach them. They created their own small universe, complete with private jokes, shared dreams, and the kind of intimate understanding that comes only from truly knowing another person's heart. But the outside world had a way of intruding on even the most carefully guarded sanctuaries. The first sign of trouble came when Jake rode into the nearby town of Tombstone for supplies and heard disturbing news. A group of Apache warriors had been raiding settlements along the Mexican border, and territorial authorities were organizing a massive manhunt to track them down. More troubling still were the rumors that began circulating about Jake himself. Some claimed he was harboring an Apache spy, while others suggested he had gone native and could no longer be trusted. The suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed him through town made it clear that his relationship with Ayanna, however secret he believed it to be, was becoming known to others. The crisis came to a head on a crisp autumn morning when a detachment of cavalry soldiers appeared at the cabin, led by Captain William Hayes, a man Jake had served under during his scouting days. Hayes was a fair but inflexible officer who believed deeply in the righteousness of American expansion and the necessity of subduing all Native American resistance. "Jake," Hayes said, dismounting from his horse with military precision, "I'm going to ask you straight out. Are you harboring an Apache woman? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jake glanced toward the cabin, where he knew Ayanna was listening from behind the partially open door. Everything they had built together, all the love and trust and hope for the future, balanced on the edge of his answer. "I am," Jake replied simply, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "And I'm not giving her up." Hayes sighed, the sound of a man who had hoped to avoid an unpleasant duty. "You know I can't let this stand, Jake. There's too much tension right now, too many people looking for someone to blame for the recent raids. If word gets out that you're protecting an Apache—" "She's not involved in any raids," Jake interrupted. "She was exiled by her own people. She's no threat to anyone." "That's not how folks will see it," Hayes replied. "And frankly, it's not how the territorial governor sees it either. I've got orders to bring in any Apache found in white settlements. No exceptions." The standoff that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it probably lasted only minutes. Jake's fellow soldiers, men he had once fought alongside, now faced him with drawn weapons. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had spent years hunting Apache warriors was now prepared to fight his own people to protect one Apache woman. It was Ayanna who broke the deadlock. She emerged from the cabin with quiet dignity, her head held high despite the circumstances. In perfect English, she addressed Captain Hayes directly. "I will come with you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I ask that you allow me to speak first." Hayes, clearly surprised by her command of English and her composed demeanor, nodded his consent. What followed was a speech that would be remembered by every man present for the rest of their lives. Ayanna spoke of her exile, of the choice she had made to leave her people rather than face execution for loving someone her tribe deemed unworthy. She talked about the month she had spent learning to read and write, about her dreams of building a life that bridged the gap between two worlds. Most powerfully, she spoke about Jake, not as a captor or protector, but as a man who had shown her that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided people. "You see an Apache woman who threatens your way of life," she concluded, her dark eyes meeting those of each soldier in turn. "I see myself as someone who could help build bridges between our peoples, if given the chance. But if my presence here brings danger to the man I love, then I will go willingly to whatever fate awaits me." The silence that followed her words was profound. Several of the younger soldiers shifted uncomfortably, clearly moved by her eloquence and dignity. Even Captain Hayes seemed shaken by the unexpected depth and sincerity of her plea. But military orders were military orders, and Hayes had his duty to perform. With obvious reluctance, he gave the command to bind Ayanna's hands. As the ropes tightened around her wrists, the same wrists that had been bound when Jake first found her, the cowboy felt something break inside his chest. "Wait," Jake said, stepping forward. "There's another way." The revelation that would change everything was about to unfold, born from a desperate love and a cowboy's refusal to let fate repeat itself. Jake Morrison was about to make a choice that would either save the woman he loved or destroy them both. And the consequences would echo across the territorial landscape like thunder rolling through mountain canyons. What Jake proposed in that moment of crisis would challenge every assumption about justice, love, and redemption in the American West. The bonds that had been cut in mercy were about to be tested by fire, and the true meaning of freedom was about to be redefined by two hearts that refused to be separated by the prejudices of their time. As Captain Hayes waited for Jake's proposal, the autumn wind whispered through the pine trees surrounding the cabin, carrying with it the promise of change and the scent of approaching winter. The story that had begun with a simple act of compassion was about to reach its climax, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jake's proposal was as audacious as it was desperate. Drawing on his years of experience as a scout and his intimate knowledge of Apache culture, he offered to serve as a mediator between the territorial government and the remaining Apache bands still fighting in the mountains. Ayana, with her unique position as someone who had lived in both worlds, would serve as his translator and cultural advisor. "Think about it, Captain," Jake argued, his voice gaining strength as the plan took shape in his mind. "How many more soldiers are going to die trying to hunt down warriors who know every canyon and cave in these mountains? How much money is the territory going to spend on campaigns that accomplish nothing but more bloodshed?" Hayes listened with growing interest as Jake outlined his proposal. The recent Apache raids had indeed been costly and largely ineffective from a military standpoint. The warriors, led by the legendary Geronimo and other chiefs, seemed to vanish into the landscape like smoke, only to reappear miles away to strike again. Ayana knows these people, their customs, their grievances, Jake continued. She could help us understand what they really want, what it would take to bring them to the negotiating table instead of the battlefield. The captain studied Ayana with new eyes, seeing not just an Apache woman, but a potential asset in ending a conflict that had already claimed too many lives on both sides. Her earlier speech had demonstrated not only her intelligence, but also her genuine desire to bridge the gap between the two cultures. After what seemed like an eternity of consideration, Hayes made his decision. He would take Jake's proposal to his superiors, but in the meantime, Ayana would remain in Jake's custody under a form of house arrest. If the territorial government approved the plan, she would be granted a conditional pardon and official status as a cultural liaison. If not, she would face the same fate that awaited all captured Apache. The weeks that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Jake and Ayana waited in their mountain refuge, their love deepened by the knowledge that their time together might be limited. They spoke of dreams and fears, of the possibility of a future together, and the likelihood that forces beyond their control would tear them apart. During this period of waiting, their relationship reached a new level of intimacy and understanding. They were no longer just two people who had found love against impossible odds. They were partners in a mission that could potentially save lives and change the course of history in the Southwest. The answer came on a cold December morning when Captain Hayes returned to the cabin, this time accompanied by a civilian official from the territorial capital. The man, introduced as Commissioner Robert Whitman, was a pragmatist who had grown weary of the endless cycle of violence that characterized relations with the Apache. "Your proposal has merit, Morrison," Whitman said without preamble. "The governor is willing to try a different approach, provided certain conditions are met." The conditions were strict but not impossible. Jake and Ayana would work under military supervision, reporting regularly to Captain Hayes. Any negotiations with Apache leaders would be conducted in the presence of army officers. Most importantly, Ayana's status would remain provisional. Any sign that she was providing information to hostile Apache would result in her immediate arrest and execution. Despite the restrictions and the ever-present threat hanging over them, Jake and Ayana accepted the terms. It was a chance, perhaps their only chance, to build a life together while serving a cause greater than themselves. Their first assignment came sooner than expected. A band of Apache warriors had taken refuge in the Chiricahua Mountains, and traditional military approaches had failed to dislodge them. The territorial government wanted Jake and Ayana to attempt contact and determine whether the warriors might be willing to negotiate rather than fight to the death. The journey into the Chiricahuas was fraught with danger and emotion for Ayana. These were her ancestral lands, places where her people had lived and hunted for countless generations. Every canyon and peak held memories and spiritual significance that Jake could only begin to understand. When they finally made contact with the Apache band, led by a war chief named Cochise's son, Naiche, the reunion between Ayana and her former people was both joyful and heartbreaking. Many of the warriors remembered her from before her exile, and their reactions ranged from joy at seeing her alive to anger at her association with white soldiers. The negotiations that followed were complex and delicate, requiring all of Ayana's cultural knowledge and Jake's diplomatic skills. The Apache warriors were tired of fighting, tired of watching their people die in a war they could not win. But they were also proud and unwilling to surrender unconditionally. Through patient dialogue and careful compromise, a framework for peace began to emerge. The Apache would be granted a reservation in their traditional lands with guarantees of food, medical care, and education for their children. In return, they would cease all raids and accept the authority of the territorial government. The agreement, when it was finally signed, represented a victory for everyone involved. The Apache gained security and the promise of a future for their children, while the territorial government achieved peace without the massive loss of life that would have resulted from continued warfare. For Jake and Ayana, the successful negotiations represented something even more precious: validation of their belief that love and understanding could triumph over hatred and prejudice. Their partnership had not only saved their own relationship, but had also contributed to saving countless lives on both sides of the conflict. As winter gave way to spring in the mountains of Arizona Territory, Jake Morrison and Ayana stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the valley they now called home. The woman who had once been bound by ropes of shame and exile was now free in ways she had never imagined possible, while the man who had cut those bonds had discovered that true freedom came not from solitude, but from sharing one's life with another. The territorial government, pleased with the success of their unconventional approach to Apache relations, had offered Jake a permanent position as Indian agent, with Ayana serving as his official translator and cultural advisor. It was work that gave meaning to their love story, transforming their personal triumph into a force for positive change in a region long torn by conflict and misunderstanding. Their wedding, when it finally took place in the spring of 1883, was a small affair attended by Captain Hayes, Commissioner Whitman, and a handful of Apache friends who had been granted permission to leave the reservation for the ceremony. The service itself was conducted by a traveling preacher who had heard their story and insisted on performing the ceremony free of charge, declaring it an honor to unite two people whose love had helped bring peace to the territory. As Ayana spoke her vows in both English and Apache, her voice strong and clear in the mountain air, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a simple act of mercy, cutting the ropes that bound a desperate woman to a desert tree, had evolved into something far more complex and beautiful than he could have ever imagined. The bonds he had severed that day had indeed been replaced by others. But these new bonds were not chains of captivity or shame. They were the golden threads of love, trust, and shared purpose that connected two hearts across the artificial boundaries of race and culture. In freeing Ayana from her physical bonds, Jake had discovered his own liberation from the loneliness and purposelessness that had defined his previous existence. Their story became legend in the territory, told and retold around campfires and in saloons, growing with each telling until it took on mythic proportions. Some versions emphasized the romance, others the political significance of their partnership in bringing peace to the region. But at its heart, it remained a simple story about the transformative power of love and the courage required to follow one's heart despite the opposition of the world. Years later, when Jake and Ayana had children of their own, beautiful, strong children, who carried the best of both their parents' heritage, they would tell them the story of how their love began. They would speak of the importance of seeing beyond surface differences to the common humanity that connects all people, and of the responsibility that comes with love to make the world a better place. The cabin in the Dragoon Mountains remained their home, but it was no longer a refuge from the world. Instead, it became a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, love over hatred, and hope over despair. Visitors came from across the territory and beyond to meet the couple whose unlikely romance had helped change the course of history in the American Southwest. As the sun set on that spring evening in 1883, Jake Morrison and Ayanna Morrison stood together as husband and wife, their hands intertwined, just as they had been on that first night when he had asked her to stay. The ropes that had once bound her were long since turned to dust, but the bonds of love they had forged together would last for all eternity. In the distance, an Apache flute played a haunting melody that drifted across the valley like a blessing, while somewhere in the gathering darkness, a coyote called to its mate. The desert wind, that had once carried whispers of ancient grudges, now sang songs of hope and reconciliation, and two hearts that had found each other against impossible odds beat in perfect harmony beneath the vast, star-filled sky of the American West. The story of the Apache woman who was tied by her own people and the cowboy who freed her had reached its conclusion, but their love story was just beginning. In a land where the past and future met in an eternal dance of conflict and resolution, they had proven that some bonds, once forged in the fire of true love, could never be broken.